We go. So I want to welcome everyone to our post discussion for the viewing of the last one in recognition and memorialization for World AIDS Day and um, the discussion about the impact of the quilt that has been produced and was established by the NAMES Project. To give some background for World AIDS Day, World AIDS Day was first observed in 1988, and each year, each organization and individuals come together to bring attention to the HIV epidemic in our endeavor to increase HIV awareness, knowledge, speak out against HIV stigma, and call for an increased response to move forward to end the HIV epidemic, a plan for America. So after viewing the last one, which is a viewing about the quilts that are assembled with panels in memory of those who were lost to the epidemic. After Michaela Howell gives us some background about the last one, we will begin our panel discussion with our three guests, Lawanda Wilkerson, Jeffrey Mills, and Edward Adams. Michaela?
Hi, I'm so glad we could all come together, and I'm, for those of you who are viewing this the first time, I'm so glad that you've had this moment to share with us. And for those who've seen it multiple times, look forward to hearing what you think about this and how you feel. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Michaela Howell. I'm an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And I'd like to ask our panelists to introduce themselves and before we start rolling here. Lawanda, do you want to start?
Yes, I'm Lolanda Wilkerson. I'm actually a teacher in Wake County. I was diagnosed 6 years ago. The way I was diagnosed was I got a telephone call that said I was from my doctor that said I was HIV positive. And then it was the dead silence. She was like, I referred you to an infectious disease clinic, and that was it. It took me a while to get over that initial shock because at the time my daughter was 16. So I have to tell her. And I got into a clinic that was very supportive. The first thing the nurse said was, "Hey, baby, can I give you a hug?" And that hug meant so much because I was going through so much emotions at that time that it was just hard for me to process. They actually helped me, encouraged me to become an advocate, especially for women. Not a lot of people where I live at, that stigma still exists. Living in a rural town, that stigma still exists. That in that video, in that movie, the last one, that stigma still exists today, and it's very real. That piece kind of really touched me.
Thank you. And there's so many themes there that I hope that we can really dive into, and what you just said. Ed and Jeff.
You're Jeff. I'm Jeff Mills. Hi. I'm 72 years old. I'm a person living with AIDS. I was diagnosed in 1989 in San Francisco. I moved here to Wilmington almost 8 years ago in April, and have since being here, especially become an advocate for people with AIDS, for long-term survivorship, and for the quilt. And working on bringing the quilt to Wilmington has really made my life much richer, and we'll talk more soon about it.
Oh, so my name is Edward Adams. I too am a long-term survivor of HIV. I've pretty much had it my entire adult life. There's a lot to unwrap about this film. This is at least my third time seeing it. and it hasn't gotten any easier. I must have cried 4 times during that. Like Lawanda mentioned, you know, when I see the women's collective thing part of this, and I see the women working so hard to just be heard and to break through the stigma, I lose it. Because there's a part in the movie where Gert and both Cleve say that it's been a failure. They've been working on it so hard their whole life that to them, it's not a failure by any means. But to them, it seems like it because we've only gotten but so far. There's so many people we have left behind. And when we were living in San Francisco for 30 years, Jeff for 40, we were kind of in the bubble where we thought we were doing really well. But we get to North Carolina and the inequalities and the disparities are just like thrown right in your face. You just can't, it's so obvious and so awful. And I saw so many parallels this time in the movie with our current pandemic to the other one where we're making the same mistakes. Everything right from where presidents who virtually don't know how to handle it and aren't even trying to the stigma associated with the people who are actually infected and won't even tell their friends, or, you know, that same stigma we dealt with then is still here. It feels like we didn't learn anything. And you can scream as loud as you want, but we're in the same spot. So I didn't understand that from Gert and Cleve the first 2 times I saw it. But this time with COVID surrounding me, I'm like, whoa, I sort of get where they're coming from now. So again, it was a tough watching again.
Yeah, I know that it's watching this, like it just pulls up so many emotions and just really, it's a really intense and emotional watch. And so thank you for working through it again with us. And yeah, it is so powerful. I mean, like Whoopi Goldberg, right, standing out there in her 90s glory, said something along the lines of like, you know, this disease is on the president, it's not on the American people, it's on the government. And I'm like, oh, look, here we are still in this same space, but it's all these interconnected components associated with stigma and access to resources and all these components. Lawanda, you'd mentioned that you're from a more rural community. And we talked a little bit about at the beginning about how there's differences in terms of access to resources. And Jeff, you'd mentioned this as well. So did you want to talk a little bit about what that looks like, whether in your community or within other rural communities in terms of access to care or barriers to care?
I can talk to that so in depth. So it's only one clinic that infectious disease clinic that deals with that. Resources in a small rural town are limited. Even getting access to help or getting organizations with help, resources are limited because by the time they get to help a certain number of people, it's still so many people that are left out that still need help with basic, and like they mentioned in the movie, if you don't have adequate housing, you can't expect people to be able to think about taking medicine. Um, their base mode is survival mode. When you're faced to have to pay rent or medicine, you're going to choose to pay. I have to pay my rent. Like you at that time, it's like I can't pay for my medicine because I need to have a roof over my head. Um, where I live at is very limited jobs where I live at. And a lot of people now, even with the pandemic, are faced with that. Um, now more than ever, because resources are still limited. I think a lot of people tend to forget the more smaller towns and rural areas and think about the big cities. But once they push that money out, it doesn't hit the rural areas. Even with education materials, a lot of people still have that stigma. A lot of people still think in my rural town, still think that you still can get HIV and AIDS from mosquito bite. And when they did that, I was like, wow, we still have people here that believe that. It's just one of those things that movie just kind of hit home that we still have a long way to go with stigma, with just being basic, having the basic resources that we need. It's still a lot left to do. Um, like Jeff, coming to North Carolina, it is an eye opener. I definitely get it because a lot North Carolina is still in that, oh my gosh, we don't want to talk about sex. We should not talk about sex. So that I honestly, yeah, abscess, even teaching kids about condoms, I think is really needed. Rural areas, and again, I hate to say it, but rural areas, a lot of younger kids are more promiscuous because nobody's talked to them about it. Nobody's talked to them about how to use a condom, what these diseases look like. Nobody's talked to them about that. I definitely think it needs to be a lot more information, a lot more education going on in rural areas.
I could not agree more. And when I, I work with my student population on campus, or on campus rather, it is astounding to me how many of them, like when we talk through HIV and AIDS in each of my courses, and we address it, especially from the disparities in access to care, especially from that angle. It's like the number of students who have no concept of HIV AIDS. When I do the pre-tests and ask them, how do you get this? Like open-ended questions for them. What does this look like? What do you have questions about? It's like you're saying, it's the mosquito bite kind of things, like, well, can you or can't you? And these are the things that I thought, again, like if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would have been like, oh yeah, we got this covered. People are learning this. But, in North Carolina, I'm more recent to North Carolina as well within the last 7 years. And you really realize what a disservice we are doing to our children. And it comes back to this, we had Jerry Falwell on this movie talking about, this stigmatizing, homosexuality and stigmatizing sexuality in any kind, and promiscuousness, which is, again, what does that even mean to them? But it's all of that plays this major role in preventing having access to be able to talk to people about this at all ages, and to build it into basic health knowledge and information. Ed and Jeff, do you want to add anything?
I would like to remark on Lawanda's experience of learning her HIV status. Ed and I were recently on a Zoom call just in the past few weeks with other HIV activists around North Carolina. And Lawanda's story reminds me of the story one young man recounted on this Zoom meeting, having recently moved from South Carolina to Asheville. He took an HIV, he had a HIV test as a routine part of his health care, signing up for his new doctors, what have you. And he was notified also, I think on telephone or maybe an email or something. And, it even, and it perhaps can be counted off as, because of a lack of resources, there's not enough resources to tell everybody their HIV status when they're newly tested because of lack of staff or what have you. But in fact, it's tone deafness, even in the world of healthcare. There's still so much to be learned about. And no one should ever have to be alone when they learn their status for the first time, if it's positive.
Well, and I totally agree. And like from a cultural competency component, right, and a humanistic stance in terms of medicine, absolutely. But also from a straight up bottom line economic component in terms of managing diseases, is that if we are contacting people and telling them in person, engaging with them directly, being able to connect them immediately to services, there's a reduction in chance that they potentially will pass on to someone else, right? We know that we will have just drop-offs in terms of who will seek care. And it's so from that very cold bottom line component, you would think that it would be managed so much better, because you don't have the resources to manage it in the town. You need to be able to have a way of addressing it and keeping numbers down. And there's one more straightforward way of doing it. And it's one that's just callous and lost to do it that way. It's so disappointing to hear. So Ed and Jeff, could you, oh, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to thank you, Michaela, for hosting tonight. And I wanted to just be sure before we left tonight that I was able to thank Lawanda and Seeds of Healing and the Frank Hart Foundation for bringing this World AIDS Day commemoration to us this year. You know, it's and I'm very proud of them for being able to include quilt blocks from the Women's Collective and panels from the Say My Name project in Atlanta. Many of those quilt panels are in the virtual quilt display that the Names Project has provided for us as part of this event.
I'd just like to add on to what Michaela was saying, in that in the state of North Carolina, I think Lawanda may also be, but I'm a part of what was called the Ending the Epidemic Council from the state of North Carolina. It brought people from all over the state, decision makers, people living with AIDS, everybody who has a stake in us getting to and having a shot at ending the epidemic. Mm-hmm. Again, as I was watching the film and seeing what we're doing with COVID, part of my anger is like, where's my HIV vaccine? I've been living with this a long time, and if I had seen this kind of like push back when I was in my 20s, maybe now I would be sitting here saying we have a vaccine, we don't have to go through all this. And it just makes me wonder, you know, when we have our meetings, just recently, and we're on our calls with the North Carolina AIDS Action Network, and we're talking to our fellow advocates, we're worried about the resources, the money. The president completely ended and ruined the AIDS Council that we had federally. The money to the states is drying up. It's all going to COVID. We're out there worried about ourselves and where we're headed next. And we're getting, you know, we're drowning. And it's a really weird spot to be in 2020. And we thought we were making such great progress. And now we're looking at each other going, holy crud, what's up next for us? So we need everybody to continue the fight and to be strong and to persevere.
Well, we're certainly seeing across the globe. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to add, you know, can you imagine a names project for COVID-19, what that would look like? You know, it would blanket the entire continent, basically.
And it looks like they need it. We need it.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add, Jeff, what you just said. When they mentioned in the last one, putting a face to the circumstance, and the quilt really displays how many people have been impacted by HIV and AIDS, I thought the same thing when it came to COVID-19 and the parallels. When you can put a narrative and a face to the pandemic, it has really a great impact, and is really challenging to see our nation and our world deal with such circumstances. And again, the need for a call to action by leadership. I heard them mention they wanted to just hear or be able to say, thank you, Mr. President. So it goes back to those who have the ability to make a difference. We wish that, you know, everyone would have access. We did not have to deal with inequities, as well as the bigotries that parallel both of the circumstances of HIV and COVID-19.
It's going to be very revealing to see, as the vaccines are rolled out, who has access and when. And we should be prepared for those inequities to continue and take what we've learned in the fight against AIDS to this as well.
I did have, yeah, well, that's a large conversation, but I do know that when the vaccines do roll out, it is definitely going to go to those on the front line, and then the convalescent settings before we see the trickle down. So but I am proud to say in our community that we are confronting that aspect of privilege to assure that those who need it most will be prioritized. So thank you for bringing that up.
I'm really heartened to hear the conversations around the vaccines and that it being, you know, that the inequities are in the front of those conversations in terms of like different news programming and that kind of those spaces. And so I have a little bit more hope that those inequities will not show up to such a strong extent like they did for the H1N1. I mean, that absolutely, that was very, there was some very clear differences in terms of who got access and who didn't. So we'll see, but it's also, you know, we see that in terms of who gets access to care when we're talking about HIV and AIDS, right? And we have, you know, it's one of the components that, you know, are fighting for is to be able to get that full access. When you're saying about how funds are being shifted out of HIV and AIDS care and resources and education, and also an emphasis is being shifted up. I mean, we have public health professionals who are being shifted into new roles that are more or closely associated with COVID, for instance. You know, we're seeing across the world right now that the rates of tuberculosis, HIV are creeping up. And that is associated with money being shifted out of those programs into COVID programs. And then of course, like we have all the issues with when diseases are all occurring at the same time and issues with nutrition and access to not just healthcare, but to clean water sources. It comes back to what Lawanda was saying about your access to housing, your access to, you know, medication. You know, if you can't eat when you're taking your pills, right, you end up having lots of really uncomfortable side effects, to say the least. So it's like we're telling people not to eat and not to take their pills unless they're eating and they don't have food, right? So it's these disparities go so deep, and of course they extend out to just basic, you know, the basics of staying alive, healthy, clean water, food to eat, food for your family, those kinds of pieces. It's such a huge challenge. And one where, like Cleve is saying that he's failed, and it's like, you haven't failed. It's just that there's such a big problem to address.
Yeah, thank you. I know that we have a few moments left, and we do have several people who joined us. If you want to unmute yourself to share comments or thoughts or questions and answers, please do so, as well as feel welcome to use the chat box. I want to thank the Frank Carr Foundation as well as the Seeds of Healing Board for supporting our endeavors. With this is the second year where we were able to host an event at this magnitude, and it could not be done without the collective work of everyone here and the resilient and courage of Lawanda, Ed, and Jeff as well, because your testimonies have a great impact, and we appreciate you for speaking out and speaking up to help us address stigma and to bring HIV awareness. I want to just share that the showing of the quilts will be on display until Friday this week, which is December 4th, from 12 to 6 p.m. at the Ormond Center, which is 1624 Princess Street. And on Saturday from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. We will also be doing HIV testing from 10 a.m. to approximately 2 p.m. on Saturday. And we will have lunch catered by Premier Catering at 12 p.m. on Saturday, December 5th. You can register online to reserve your spot, but for COVID precautions, I want everyone to be assured that we do not allow more than 6 people in the building at a time. Masks are mandatory, as well as hand sanitizer is present. If you cannot tour at any of those times, you can reach out to the Frank Carr Foundation and we can make reservations for you. The Frank Carr Foundation email address is info@frankcarrfoundation.org. I think we have a couple comments in the box, so I just wanted to share. Beth stated that she saw the quilts in DC in the early 90s with her brother, and it was impressive and made it very real. Thank you for sharing, Beth. And Mindy as well. She had the pleasure of seeing the quilts all around the Washington Monument in DC during the International AIDS Conference in 2012. What a sight to see. The moment is one that will always stick in my mind, walking and reading each panel. It's so interesting that Beth and Mindy, two of the Seeds of Healing board members, thank you for sharing. And they too have been impacted and affected by the HIV epidemic. And I thank you guys for being here this evening.
Thanks for having us both.
Yes. Okay. Do you guys have any closing remarks?
I would just encourage everyone, if you can, and if you haven't seen LaShonda's quilt panel made for her mother, you should definitely check it out. It's
Yeah.
a great piece of art.
And Ed has a quote in the making on display as well. And Jeff has Jeff has a history of having made a quote as well, right?
So yes, as a matter of fact, so watching this movie is so poignant. And you know, Ed saw images in this movie of at least 3 or 4 people that he knows personally, knew before they passed away. We saw quilt panels in the movie of people that we know. It's pretty amazing. And Ed and I together submitted 2 quilt panels to the Names Project in the 1992 display. It was 6 months after we had met. We met in New York City. Ed was living in Atlanta and I in San Francisco. So, but we met each other in Washington, D.C. and submitted those 2 quilt panels. My mother was even there and my sister at that event. It was so, and the film does a lot to kind of convey the impact on people of seeing the quilt in person. And maybe we need, you know, unfortunately, to wait for a little while longer before we can get together to see them in the future.
Yeah.
And I wanted to thank Lawanda for being here too.
Oh, thank you. I
Thank
miss
you,
you
Lawanda.
guys.
Yeah. Thank you for being here, Lawanda.
Thank you.
Lawanda,
Okay.
do you have any closing comments or things that you really want people to take home from this?
Just take in consideration that just or to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. Because at any given moment, it can be anybody. It's not, don't put a stigma on it because people from any walk of life can contract it. It's not anybody's disease. It's not a particular group of people. It's just people in general. Just being careful, going and not being ashamed to get tested is what I want people to take away from it. And just knowing their status. And even not being ashamed of it is what I want people to take away from it.
Thank you. And then Jeff, do you have anything that you want people to take away from this? Oh, you're muted.
I'm trying.
Yay. For me, it's the exact same. Know your status, get tested, get in care. While in care, you know, the undetectable rate that you're gonna achieve is gonna make it so you can't transmit it to anybody else. We don't have a vaccine, but we do have some really good meds, and they really, I'm able to live a wonderful life on very simple meds with minimal side effects, and I've lived a really long time. So, stigma shouldn't be there. The meds are, get yourself set up, work it out.
Thank you.
My takeaway is simply share this far and wide. The more people we reach, the fewer people will have to memorialize. And thanks so much for.
Thanks, Michaela.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, LaShawn.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Michaela.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Jeff. And Lawanda, thank you so much for bringing us all together. And even in this really strange upside down time.